Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas. Our ongoing study on Being a Christian by Professor Hans Kuhn, published in 1976. We're going to look at pages 353 to 363. We're going to look at the triad of Ascension, Pentecost, Eternity. Ascension, Pentecost, Eternity. Let's begin with Ascension in Block 1. We read that it is from the state of divine power that the resurrected Jesus appears. The Easter appearances are the already exalted Jesus, the already ascended Jesus. Raising from death and exaltation to God are one event, says Professor Kuhn. Jesus is both Lord of the Church, Lord of the world. He is the definitive rule of God. So exaltation as definitive lordship. Luke separates resurrection and exaltation in time. The ascension in Bethany closes the time of Jesus' appearances and opens up the period of church mission. Luke combines the taking up of Elijah and the words from the Psalms of sitting on the right hand of the Father. The disappearance from earth concerning Jesus is being explained by Luke. Therefore, Block 1, Note 3, exaltation of Jesus and Jesus' divine lordship equals the explanation for the disappearance from earth of Jesus. The cloud of the Ascension, which is in the book of Acts, symbolizes both the closeness of God and the unapproachability of God. Luke converted the exaltation statements into an exaltation story. He was trying to correct the widespread imminent expectation of parousia. Instead of inactive waiting, there needed to be active mission. The task of mission was left to the disciples. Exaltation leads to task of mission. The Holy Spirit was coming to equip the disciples. Luke says that to fully understand Easter, we must witness to Jesus in the world. The Ascension event is parousia in reverse. Key note from Professor Kuhn. Note 4, subpoint D. The Ascension is not a second salvation event. It is an emphasized aspect of Easter. It is, from the historical critical method, Ascension is an aspect of Easter. Now the transition to Pentecost. In the book of Acts, we are informed of Pentecost, the 50-day feast, the harvest festival event for the Jews. Luke places the event in the context of the promise and fulfillment within the history of salvation. It's the feast of the gift of the Spirit and the birth of the church, the mass ecstasy under the influence of Spirit. Now, because we have an emphasis on Luke here in Block 1 by Professor Kuhn, he emphasizes Luke and emphasizes the fact that there's a separation of resurrection and ascension, which he says should not be the case. But there actually is another ascension account. There's an ascension account in Mark 16, 19, and 20, the earliest gospel. When the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was received up and set down at the right hand of God. Ana lambano is used in the aorist indicative passive to be taken up into heaven. So we have the ascension recorded by Mark, the earliest gospel, prior to Luke. But the key point for me in Luke is not the actual ascension account, but what happens in between resurrection and ascension. In Luke 24:45, after the resurrection, we read, "Then Jesus opened their understanding." This opening of their understanding for the disciples occurs between resurrection and ascension. And it really means in the Greek, he opened their mind. And it means that he opened their mind so they could put the two things together of his ministry and his resurrection appearance. That way they would be led to full understanding of ascension, which followed this opening of their understanding. So Luke really is a progression from resurrection to opening of understanding to comprehension of ascension. It is truly an event that takes place in the invisible realm of the living God. All three take place there. The resurrection appearance, we've already discussed that, but then the opening of understanding, and then the understanding of ascension. So to me that's key. Luke 24:45 is key. Now the incident he mentions here is Acts 1:9-12, where he's lifted up and a cloud receives him. But for me, the Luke account emphasizes something critically important, because we know that Professor Kuhn does posit an objective resurrection. And we're going to talk about it again in block 3 here, but he also emphasizes the miracle of the opening up of understanding. Well, that to me is Luke 24:45. Dianoigo nous. He opened up their mind and opened them to synthesizing the two things of Jesus' ministry and his resurrection appearance, which then prepared them for the understanding of ascension, the interpretation of ascension. So I think this was an opening up as they walked toward Bethany. Jesus always would open up understanding as they walked. So I think this has occurred on the way to Bethany. Let's take a look at block 2 now. Let's take a look at the Pentecost account. Pentecost completes baptism. In the New Testament, baptism, which recreates Easter, is also the sacrament of reception of Spirit. Even in the Pentecost narrative, reception of Spirit is linked with baptism as a completion of baptism. Pentecost, the 50-day festival, begins with Easter Vigil. It's the feast of the risen Christ. Pentecost celebrates the risen Christ. People prayed standing and singing in liturgy. In the 5th century, a separate feast of Pentecost was celebrated. A historical approach to the feast prevailed in the order of Easter, Ascension, and then Pentecost. An annual liturgy of feast emerged within the church. Now, block 2, note 3. As a completion of baptism and as a celebratory feast, Pentecost is reception of the Spirit message. The message that the crucified Jesus lives forever with God. As an obligation and a hope for humanity. The comprehensive fulfillment was still to come. The resurrection was seen as the presupposition of last judgment. Under presupposition for last judgment, God's cause would now succeed. Resurrection is part of God's self-justification, his argument in theodicy, the answer to the theodicy question. Blessed art thou, O Lord, that quickens the dead. God is faithful to his cause. He is faithful in death. He is faithful beyond death. Jesus is our sign of hope. Jesus' resurrection begins the eschatological new age. So we have critical information here in block 1 on the Ascension account. Then we have the Pentecost account, but Professor Kuhn links resurrection, ascension, and Pentecost all together. They're all basically events of divine opening up of the understanding, new perception in the new reality of God, something beyond finitude, in the realm of transcendence. But they are all accounts from varying communities and varying experiences. But he wraps it up under the concept of eternity. This realm of God is called the realm of eternity. Within the realm of eternity, resurrection was witnessed. Within the realm of eternity, ascension was understood. Within the realm of eternity, Pentecost resulted in reception of Spirit. Let's go to block 3. This is going to give us the author's conclusions. Eternity equals a new life which escapes the dimensions of space and time, beyond finitude, within God's invisible domain. A definite life, a concrete life with God. Assumption into ultimate reality. So under assumption into ultimate reality, resurrection and ascension must be seen as one identical happening within the hiddenness of God. Jesus did not die into nothingness. He was taken up into the ultimate reality of God. For believers, death is a transition to God. We would agree emphatically with that statement. So block 3, note 3, eternity of God's domain, and resurrection and ascension as one equals death as a transition to God. Through death we enter within God's imperishable dimension, from the visible to the invisible, to God's eternal light, where our Father awaits. So, note 4, death and resurrection form a differentiated unity. We do not only give interpretive meaning to the cross, but that certainly is something that we do. But it's not only that. Resurrection occurs with death, meaning exaltation and glorification. It's the return moment to the Father. On the third day he rose again is not a calendar date, but a day of salvation. So he's very definite on declaring that resurrection and ascension are both identical happenings. When Jesus was witnessed as resurrected, he was understood as ascended. Even though we have the 3 steps in Luke, that's just done for our benefit to clarify what's taking place, but you have the resurrection appearance, the opening of understanding, and then the understanding of ascension. So Luke kind of lays it out there for us, but that's basically to be seen as a single stream of miraculous unveiling. But we wrap up the conclusion with 3:5, the day of salvation. In resurrection we are taken up from death as God's act, a gift of true miracle. Man's new life is a matter of faith, breaking through to the holy other dimension. The real of God and the rule of Christ. There you go. That's the dimension. As believers, we live in the real of God and the rule of Christ. Resurrection can never be proven by historical argument, and Professor Kuhn does not try to do that. The only way to the risen Christ is faith. The resurrection is object of faith, period. So note 7, resurrection as object of faith, a radicalizing of faith in God. The resurrection is not mere interiorization. It is faith in the Creator who calls things from nothingness, not verified rationally, but hoped for by faith. And then he gives us some comments about the method of historical criticism. I'm very glad that he did this, because as conservatives, everyone needs to understand this. We are not upset by historical criticism because we recognize the relativity of historical questions. Paul spoke of a spiritual body. Luke spoke of a corporeal body. John introduced entirely new elements. Historically, the Easter faith may have emerged in Galilee. The diversity of resurrection accounts is a result of a diversity of communities. What is decisive for us is that resurrection and ascension equals the new life of Jesus with God. The new life of Jesus with God. So again, resurrection is perceived in the dimension of eternity. Ascension is understood in the dimension of eternity as a further aspect of resurrection. Pentecost, that's the receiving of the Spirit as the culmination of real baptism. So Ascension and Pentecost are abbreviated under the realm of eternity. That's why he says that we don't talk about historical finitude when we talk about resurrection. We talk about an entirely other realm. And we talk about the opening up of understanding. No witness immediately recognized Jesus. There had to be a moment of opening up of understanding and interpretation. That had to take place. And the best information we have is Luke 24:45 through 53. Go to Luke 24:45 to 53. You could probably take the whole chapter of Luke 24. But after the resurrection, then in 24:45, Jesus opened their understanding. The anoigo nous. He opened their mind so they could put together the two things of Jesus' ministry and resurrection appearance. He did this as they walked toward Bethany, and then they came to the realization that his resurrection was ascension. He was lifted up, and a cloud received him. This is the three-step fluid process of understanding within the dimension of the real of God. The real of God and the rule of Christ. The real of God and the rule of Christ. And so, my recommendation is hold on to Luke 24. Hold on to Luke 24. But remember, the Ascension was recorded in the earliest Gospel, Mark 16:19 through 20. The Ascension was recorded by Mark in the earliest Gospel. So, as conservatives, we accept the historical, concrete reality of resurrection, ascension, and eternity. But we can certainly find room here to take on this teaching by Professor Kuhn, because he abbreviates Ascension and Pentecost under eternity. Resurrection, Ascension, and Pentecost are abbreviated under eternity, the realm of the real of God and rule of Christ. The real of God and the rule of Christ. Within that dimension of the real of God and the rule of Christ, the disciples witnessed resurrection appearance. The disciples witnessed and interpreted ascension. And how was that visualization? It was a miracle, and it was described differently. Paul emphasized spiritual body. Luke emphasized corporeal body. John added entirely new elements to resurrection. So, the critical point, a new life of Jesus with God was revealed within the real of God and the rule of Christ. That dimension of the real of God and the rule of Christ. That's going to wrap up this lesson on pages 353 to 363. We will pick up next time on page 364.